In my previous video on the Powkiddy X18S, I looked at how this clamshell device with a Unisoc T618 processor was able to emulate just about every PSP game at 2 or 3 times its original resolution at a full 30 or 60 FPS. In this video, I'll be continuing my testing on the system and taking a look at Nintendo 64 emulation through 10 of your favorite games. How does this next generation handheld emulate one of gaming's most beloved systems? Let's find out. If you liked the video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, and a reminder that longer versions of the gameplay is hosted on my second channel, JimRPG2, so subscribe to that channel as well. For Nintendo 64 emulation, I'm using M64Plus FZ, which is a free app on the Google Play Store. I did try a couple of other emulators, but I found this one to be the easiest to use and also having the best performance. All games are running at the default settings on the emulator, which includes playing them at 640 by 480p resolution. I'm starting off with Banjo Kazooie, and performance was pretty good at around 30 FPS during gameplay. This game has non-skippable cutscenes, and the frame rate here is in the low 20s or even high teens. Of the 3 rare games I've tested, Banjo Kazooie seems to be the one that's held up the best in terms of gameplay, which mostly seems to be collecting objects through a range of platforming challenges, so I recommend trying this one out. Conker's Bad Fur Day is the second rare game on the list, and performance isn't quite up to Banjo Kazooie's level. In gameplay, the game can dip down to 20 FPS, though it's still somewhat playable here. The cutscenes have similar performance, so this is one that really needs better hardware to emulate properly. The 7-minute non-skippable cutscene at the start also makes this a bit slow to get into, and cutscenes can only be skipped after watching them at least once. Cruisin USA runs really well at a solid 30 FPS most of the time. The graphics are really nice, and the textures aren't that blocky low-res style, which can be quite prevalent in these early 3D games. This game definitely looks better than your average PS1 level driving game. The theme of the game, driving across the USA, is really cool. The only complaint I have is that the driving mechanics, at least for the car I'm using here, aren't that great. Steering the car feels like it leans the opposite way a little too much for my liking, and the steering in general feels extremely twitchy. Overall, it's a good experience, marred a little by the handling. F-Zero X runs fantastic on the Powkiddy X18S. The track design is really next level in this game compared to F-Zero on the SNES. The game runs at a solid 60 FPS. Keep in mind that F-Zero on the GameCube might not run on this device, so that makes the Nintendo 64 version a fine substitute. I really like the high number of 30 AI races on the track. Overall, this is definitely one to play on the X18S. Goldeneye unfortunately might get the award for the game that's aged the poorest from the games I've tested. Firstly, the controls just feel off, and I realized that before Halo, these controls were generally acceptable. The left analog stick turns the character, while holding down the trigger aims the crosshair on the gun, which is fine, but I found it tricky to aim, and the crosshair seems to bounce back to the center a lot. Secondly, the camera controls were just really annoying to get used to. In terms of performance, it's poor here. It generally runs at around 20 FPS, though in indoor scenes it can get up to 60 FPS. Part of the reason the frame rate is so low, I think, is the very large environments in this game, particularly on the first level, the dam, where you can see a long way into the distance. One thing that holds up really well is the familiar bomb music, but I think in general this game, together with its performance, is difficult to recommend. The performance on The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask isn't great either. The frame rate counter shows it was 20 FPS most of the time, although this does feel fairly smooth and playable. I only got up to the first town area, and in general I didn't really have any problem with the gameplay. I think if you didn't have the frame rate counter on and didn't know what it was, this would be playable for most gamers. Mario Kart 64 ran pretty well at a solid 30 FPS. It'll be really interesting to see if Mario Kart Double Dash on the GameCube runs on the Powkiddy X18S, so if that doesn't, Mario Kart 64 might be the best remaining option. To be honest, Mario Kart 64 feels a little premature, so the tracks still feel a little bit bare bones and not as exciting as some later entries. Between this and F-Zero, I find F-Zero a much more interesting game, which also has better performance on the Powkiddy X18S. Mario Tennis is very playable on the X18S, but there are some minor emulation issues. Firstly, there are some graphical glitches in this game where objects and textures are missing, and in replay, the graphics will glitch out. It's not too big of a deal since those are non-playable sections anyway. If you don't mind about that, the performance during gameplay is fine. Even though the frame rate says it's less than 30 FPS, the game seems to play well. Be sure to check out the Mario Tennis upload on my second channel as I played through some nail-biting games. Super Mario 64 plays great, and while I haven't played the recent Mario Triple Pack on the Nintendo Switch featuring Super Mario 64, I can say that this emulated version looks pretty good. For me, I'm not the biggest fan of the 3D Mario games, and in general I just prefer 2D platformers, but overall if you want to play this, performance is pretty good here and it's at 30 FPS most of the time. I'm pretty impressed with Waverace 64. It looks like a game to show your friends the power of your new console. The wave physics are really good here and the graphics in general still hold up well, mostly because the art style has aged gracefully. About the only complaint I have is that the controls are a little tricky. It's difficult to do a tight turn on the jet ski, so it can feel like turning an ocean liner at times, though if it's timed right it can be done easier. Even though the frame rate counter says 20 FPS, I have the feeling it is very smooth, so very much like Majora's Mask, where if you didn't know the frame rate, you would be fine with the performance. Overall, Nintendo 64 emulation is a bit of a mixed bag compared to PSP performance. Whereas with PSP performance, most of the time games would run at the full FPS without any issue, here Nintendo 64 games varied greatly. Some games ran great at up to 60 FPS like F-Zero X, other games ran well at 30 FPS like Cruisin USA or Super Mario 64, but there were also others with graphical glitches like Mario Tennis, and some that felt fine but the FPS counter was at 20 FPS. And then there were others like Goldeneye and Conker's Bad Fur Day that still require more power to emulate better. Overall, I'd say X18S Nintendo 64 performance is okay, not great, and you can play a fair number of games well, but I find PSP performance to be more satisfying. That's going to be it for this one. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.